You're listening to Dr. Emma and me on the Tudors Dynasty and Beyond podcast. And now, here are your hosts.
Hey, Emma.
Hi.
You know what day it is, right?
Yes, I do know what day it is. I'm super excited today.
Because it's Thirsty Thursday.
Well, yes, but because it's Parallel Lives again, so I'm going to say it.
Yes.
And because we have a wonderful guest. I'm so excited.
I'm excited about this episode too, because we have a guest who hasn't been on in a while, but honestly is one of my favorite guests. And I'm so excited that you invited him on to Dr. Emma and me for our Parallel Lives series that we've been doing for a while. If you're watching right now and you're like, who are these people and what are they doing? You must be brand new to the podcast. This is Dr. Emma and me. It's part of Tudor's Dynasty and Beyond, but every Thursday, Emma and I just have a good time talking about history. And sometimes we have guests on to help us talk about two figures in history. And I guess, can I go ahead and introduce our guest for today?
Of course.
Okay. Well, I am so happy to welcome back Dr. James Taffe. Welcome.
Hi. Thank you for having me back.
Yes, I feel like the last time you and I chatted, I think you got a little bit of a sense of my weird sense of humor, and that caught you off guard a little bit.
Wasn't there something about an onion? I remember
Yes, there was.
It still haunts me to this day, that question.
You poor man.
No, it was great and very memorable as well.
He was like, what have I gotten myself into?
That's what I think every Thursday.
Good. Poor Emma. She really has to deal with me all the time where she's like, where is Rebecca going on this right now? But we're excited today because we are doing a Parallel Lives with you. And one of the subjects that I know you know a ton about because you wrote a book about her is Jane Boleyn. And then maybe, do you, James, want to introduce who the second person is?
Sure, yes. I think anyone who's heard of Jane Boleyn will probably know of him. It is Henry Parker, or rather Henry Baron Morley, I think he's probably better known as. And he is, of course, Jane's father.
Yes. And so this is, to me, right off the bat, there's parallels because they're father and daughter. But I have no idea where this episode is going to go today. I honestly.
Oh, well, nor do I. So, I mean, I remember when you asked if I could pick two parallel lives, you'll know that I was tempted to pick the above stairs and the below stairs of the Tudor court because I thought their lives must have run parallel. But I couldn't resist talking about Jane just a little bit more. And even though I've spoke a lot about her already, I'm always drawn back to her. So I'm glad that you agreed that the two of them would make good subjects for this series.
Most definitely. Emma, I'm going to let you take the lead again. How about that?
Well, I'm so glad Jane said yes to my invitation. We'll just disclose that I was so excited about everything James proposed that I said yes to everything, and then got really confusing for all of us. So thank you for your patience, James.
No, of course. I'm just glad to be here. I'm glad to be out.
Behind the scenes looks like.
Yeah, no, I figured I don't envy you that position, I have to say. The amount of running a podcast, I'm sure. Oh, I don't know that I could do it. Very, very, very impressed.
You have to ask Rebecca about that. I just show up, James, to be honest with you. She's very generous.
My job, I think,
show up and talk about Catherine of Aragon.
Yeah. I think we agree my job is to babysit and manage Emma.
Yes, exactly. And she does a very good job so far, so I'm just a happy toddler here. We're ready to listen to you, James, because the second you said Jane Boleyn and Sir Henry Parker as an art historian, the first thing, I don't know much about these two people, and I'm so excited you chose them, but because I didn't know a lot, I was excited. I'm like, yes, I'm going to learn so much because it is a time I know a lot about. It's just these specific people I don't know. But as soon as Henry Parker came, the name came about, I had a picture in my head. Right. And it was his famous portrait, right? By no other than Dürer, the famous Albert Dürer from Germany. And this portrait is in the British Museum. So, I mean, this guy must have been really important, right, James?
Absolutely. I think it's always helpful to put a face to the name. We can always sort of access them a bit better that way. And although we lack a sort of obvious portrait for Jane Boleyn, which is very unfortunate, for Henry, he has a very distinct one, which I mean, I am no art historian. That is something I lean on everybody else's work whenever I need to look at a portrait or need to explain its significance. And I'm going to put you on the spot now, Emma, because there was one thing I've always wondered about this portrait, and I wondered if maybe you might have a theory. And it's that I believe it's unusual to me anyway that his hand is sort of tucked into his coat in the picture. And I've always noticed that and thought, what's that? Has he got an itch? I can't imagine what the significance of his hand being tucked in like that is. You'd imagine he'd be holding a pen because he's a writer and a translator or something. But don't know. Do you have any ideas? I didn't even try and look it up, I have to be honest. This is not, as I said, I'm not the art historian in residence here.
Well, I am, so I can try and
Well, there
answer
you go.
that. Well, to me, I've never noticed that, and that is significant because it's odd, right? And I've never noticed that because what I've always noticed is his chain, his bling, right? He's got a big chain on, a big necklace he's wearing. It certainly looks like he's dressed as an official diplomat. This thing
Mhm.
about putting, and this is an artist from the Northern Renaissance, a German artist, but Dürer is someone who takes a lot from Italian art. This is a Renaissance art. So the hand tucked in, it brings me back to like Italy. And I'm thinking of Medici portraits and other people like that. So it's very interesting that you mentioned that. And now that you mention it, I'm not sure I know of another portrait by a Northern Renaissance artist. I'm sure there are, but not at the top of my head. So that to me is saying that it's probably not very a common occurrence. So now
Right.
I'm going to go down this rabbit hole, James. Thank you very
Please
much.
do. Because I mean, I'm just, as I said, I would be totally out of my depth if I tried to figure that out. But I looked at it again just today, just to sort of refresh my memory. And I thought, that is unusual. I don't think I've ever noticed that because we draw so much attention to hands and often what people are holding or because there's always significance in that and what jewelry they're wearing and such. But then I thought, well, his hand is hidden there. And I couldn't come up with a theory, I'm afraid. So yeah,
Si-
please do go down that rabbit hole and let us know.
Maybe it's symbolism. Maybe as we talk today, you'll come up with an answer.
Well,
Potentially.
my first thought would be when someone doesn't want to draw a hand is that they're not a very good artist. Hands are very
Oh,
difficult to draw. We all know that, right? If you
Yeah.
ever
right.
tried to draw a hand in any position, they're difficult. Actually, some paintings are like it's more if I have to draw the hands, right? But I don't think that's the case with Jira because this is such a detailed portrait.
Right.
So you write that, and I do think you have an art historian in you, James, because that is something that I've never noticed. Because I always go to the bling and the big clothes he's wearing, and he's a full of drama. This guy, right, in this portrait. So, but that's very interesting, and I don't think it's because Stuart didn't know how to draw hands. Because Stuart, believe me, knew how to draw hands. I think I'm going to put you on the spot now and ask you when could have Dürer painted him? Dürer lived in Germany, visited the Netherlands in 1520-21. It just, whenever I find connections between continental artists and English subject sitters, I'm like, well, they must have met somewhere, right?
Right.
Tell us a
I
bit more
mean,
about his career.
I don't really know exactly when it would have been, but I suppose because I believe it was in the early 1520s, and I believe part of that period of his life, he was sent as an envoy or an ambassador for England
Hmm.
abroad. But I've never really looked in detail at his sort of more diplomatic side of his career. I've really only really paid attention to anything that could be more sort of familial or more based around Jane, really, if I was being honest. I always
Yes.
struggle when it comes to bringing the significance of someone's familial background when writing about them. Because, for instance, with Jane, there's so little that has survived about her childhood and her early years. But we want to believe that her father and her mother would have had some presence in it. And if he had, so I mean, him being a diplomatic envoy or an ambassador of sorts, he could have come into contact with Jura then, I would imagine. So that would be my guess. But you have put me on the spot there because it's the sort of details that go right over my head. I really don't think too carefully, if I'm being honest, about diplomacy. It's kind of anything that goes outside of England, I struggle with. And I tend to rely on the expertise of other historians because God knows I will never be quite as capable as that. It's always been a bit of a lacking point for me, knowing enough about the geography of someone's career.
Well, you know what? I'm here for you, James, if you ever, because I'm like looking at England from outside all the time, right? Making tons of mistakes about everybody's family line. So I think we're the
I'm not
perfect
the only
tandem,
one.
really.
Yeah.
But that makes complete sense to me. There's many portraits of ambassadors, diplomats. We know about Thomas Boleyn, obviously, too, related to that kind of family. So it has to be during this time. Another good way to look at this, I can't remember off the top of my head in this specific portrait, but if it has any year on it or how old he was, and then just like by looking at the guy's face, right? Is he old? Is he young? And all those things. And also another thing that you could look at is the style of his clothing. And because in the 1510s, there's a style, in the 1520s, there's another style, in the 1530s, there's a different style. So that always helps a lot. But this is what you were saying. Because we have a portrait of him, we keep talking about him. And I do want to talk about Jane. And why do you think there's no picture of her? Oh, I'm going to put you on the spot again. But as you've studied her life and her family and all of that, being a relevant, I have my theory, right?
Okay.
But I want to hear your theory first. Let's see. Why is there no picture of Jane?
I mean, I've this again just shows the lack of interest on my part in the art because it's just out of my depth. But what I would say is that because obviously we have all of those wonderful portraits by Holbein, and we
Mm-hmm.
have so many faces to so many members of the court, and dare I say it, some of them fairly like sort of more forgettable and sort of nobodies compared to Jane, if you ask me, that, but we have portraits of them, and it would be wonderful to say, oh wow, we know who that's what he looks like. Let's go and have a little look at his career, and you find it's just gray. There's nothing of interest. And it's like, well, okay, so just because you've got a portrait doesn't mean you're interesting. Is my kind of be my first point. But with Jane, I can believe that they would have had her portrait painted at some point, or at least sketched. I don't really have much of a theory as to why not. I mean, anyone who's read my book knows I sort of put an anonymous woman, a portrait of an
Mm-hmm.
unknown woman on the front. And I'll be honest with your listeners, Rebecca, the cynical side of me thought that it would probably sell better if there was a face to the name.
True.
And we don't know who that is. So I guess it could still be Jane. But no, realistically, I think that there are so many portraits where we don't really know who they are. And the amazing work of art historians brings us closer and closer every day to try and figure out who these people are. And we so often find that we are proving when a portrait isn't someone, I think, more often than not. And that's the case with Jane. We often, that one that's the Lady Parker portrait, the Holbein sketch, we
Mm-hmm.
often thought that that was Jane at one point. Although, if you really sort of interrogate it even a little bit, it kind of becomes obvious that it can't be her because why would she have ever been Lady Parker? But yeah, I don't I have to say, Emma, again, I don't really have much of a theory, but I guess you could say maybe it could have been destroyed because she was a lady of disrepute by 1542. I'd like to believe because of who she was that it would have been painted.
I mean, you keep saying you don't know anything about history, and you keep nailing every answer, James.
Well,
You're totally right.
maybe I'm just
Anyone
modest.
related to the Boleyns, the
Right.
downfall was so great, and Henry got rid of everything. And you can
Mhm.
go to Henry's post-mortem inventory, and you can see there's like two mentions to the Boleyns in that inventory when they were so important for so long, right? So everything
Mhm.
was destroyed. You're right.
Hmm.
So I agree with you that she would have been painted. And my other note to this, since you are becoming an art historian, we can
Right.
tell,
On
and
this
there's no
Gradually.
one
episode.
who there's no one who could find I'm telling you this because you know her life so well. You are the one that needs to find this portrait. It can't be an art historian. You're the one who knows the sources. You're the one who knows her life, and it's just getting rid of that kind of fear, right? And I think in the sketches of Holbein, we will find a portrait of Jane Boleyn. We have to be very careful with the naming of those sketches because it wasn't done at the time that those sketches were painted. Now, some of them have proven to be wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Okay. A lot of them are wrong, actually, I can tell
Mm.
you. So I would encourage you to, get obsessed with them. Just, well, you are because you chose one of them for your book. Your wonderful book, by the way. Everybody needs to read this book. So I
Thank you.
encourage you to get rid of that kind of like thing and just go back and it has to be you, James. It's not going to be anyone else. I promise you.
Well, I mean,
Art
one of the
historian
things
work.
I do love about this job is that there are so many that when you start researching a new project, there's always something that you don't know. And then you have the excuse to then go and research it and find it out. And I am definitely guilty of trying to avoid anything that's got too much of an international context because I feel like there is so much to learn about that country or that region first. Before I even get started, I would need to know more about that court's culture. Not every court was the same, even if they were more than one Renaissance court, they would have had their own distinct characters. And so, I mean, I would love to know more, for instance, about Mary Tudor, as in Henry VIII's sister's time in France and her court.
Mm.
But then you say France to me, I immediately go, oh, maybe I don't know anything about that, or maybe I won't be able to read the sources. And art is very similar for me that way. I don't feel like I look at a portrait and immediately find. I don't feel like I see it the same way that art historians do. I don't have quite the inquisitive mind as I think you need for portraits, but maybe there's an art historian in me. I would like to think so, Emma. So I'm glad that you think so too.
Yes, I definitely think so. And I think it would be a great compliment to your research because you study a time where portraiture explodes, really, right,
Mm-hmm.
with Holbein.
That's
And
right.
I'm sure you'll get more and more familiar as you go working on it because we need to put a face to the Boleyns.
True.
I wanted to ask you about the sketches of Anne Boleyn, for example, and what are your thoughts on those? And also the sketch of Holbein, I think, is George Boleyn, who was married to Jane, if I'm not mistaken. I'm a Tudor historian, but then I don't know who's who. So I would say don't be scared. If you need any help on the Spanish monarchy or Mary in France, I can help you for sure. So I had to get rid of that scaredness when I would read a book like yours, because I'm like, how am I ever going to know this? How am I ever going to know who's who? And I mix them all up. Well, that's because of my personal issues in my brain. um,
Right.
I'd say get rid of that fear and go for it. And if you need help, hey, I'm here for you. Rebecca too is very good at these things. She's always playing devil's advocate too. I'm like, this is my cousin, and she's like, well, that doesn't look like your cousin. Are you sure?
Well, it's just it. I was just going to ask Rebecca as well if you have that same fear of like when you try and learn a new topic, especially with your research on Thomas Seymour. And
Yeah.
we were just talking before we started recording about these the watermarks that you mentioned in your recent Substack, and I just thought that is something I know absolutely nothing about. But as we're saying, I have a similar example that came up, and then the immediate thing is, oh, I need to find out about this. That's the best reaction when you think I found something I need to know more, you know?
Yeah, I think for me in my research, the thing I stay away from because it overwhelms and intimidates me is battles and wars.
Oh,
Mm.
yes, absolutely.
I cannot go.
Yeah,
I don't know. It should interest me because it tells part of a story, but to me, it's overwhelming. There's so much to understand and to learn. And obviously, I've never fought in a war, so I don't know how to relate to it.
we have that in
That makes
common.
sense.
I am intentionally vague in my writing about anything that I'm just so unsure about, and war is definitely one of them. Not that I
Yeah.
wouldn't like an excuse to know a little bit more, but I've often strayed away from it.
Yeah. Let's talk about something you are comfortable with. Okay, because we've put you on the
Please.
spot quite a bit here.
Way too much. That's my superpower, James. Sorry.
No, that's okay.
You were
That's
talking,
fine.
I'm like, I'm actually the opposite to James. I just find something like I dive in, I just make assumptions, I just, and I'm so comfortable with it. And then I'm proven wrong. I'm like, okay, next thing.
Yes.
Yeah, you've got to be fearless in some ways in this work, I think, for sure. It's only a good thing.
I
Well,
think that has to be every type of historian, and it's
Yeah.
great that you are the way you are, and it's great I am the way I am, and just collaboration is key for me. So that's why, if you need anything, be sure to ask me. I'm here for you.
yes.
Thank you. I will take you up on that.
Okay, let's talk about Jane, because she is your specialty.
Yes,
Mhm.
I feel more comfortable with that.
Okay, well, and I know nothing about her father, so I would love it if maybe you'd kind of start off and let us know if you found any similarities, any parallels from Jane's life to her father's.
Hmm.
Yes, so I think the reason I like the idea of them as parallel lives is because their lives will have interacted inevitably as family, but in the surviving source material, they don't appear to. It's almost like they have two separate lives which are going on alongside one another, which obviously isn't true. That's just the impression that you get. And the reason why I think that they're interesting is because they both have careers in a sense. And that's a very awkward word to use because it can be interpreted in many ways. But I'm using it in the sense of a relationship with the crown. They both have that in common, but they don't necessarily have the same relationship with the crown. And I think that's sort of where my interest in Jane began, is how her relationship of service and what it was like for her as a servant to a mistress, and how she had a career as a lady in waiting to Henry VIII's queens. In one sense, we often can describe her father, Lord Morley, as a courtier, but I think the more accurate and sort of more nuanced reading is to say he wasn't really a courtier, because the word sort of implies regular attendance at court, and I'm not really sure that Morley fits that very well. He had a career certainly in Parliament, and he was a Justice of the Peace, and he was a peer, and he sat in on treason trials, and he was remarkably good at attending those. But he doesn't really have the qualities that you would expect of a man who is taking part in sort of the cutthroat politics of the Tudor court. Whereas Jane does. And I think that's what's really interesting, is that she's the woman of the two of them. And if we compare their careers in that sense of what was capable, what a man could do and what a woman could do in this period, Jane sort of subverts it. I feel like Jane does what her father doesn't, and probably doesn't do by choice. Their careers are so, probably saying a lot here without saying very much, but I find their careers to be so different in the sense of Jane is very present and very near to the crown. And in that sense, there are greater consequences for that. Whereas Morley sort of stays on the periphery, sort of within the safety of what he knows best, which is sort of his intellectual pursuits and how he writes and translates Latin and Italian texts and sort of presents them to the king quite often, and sometimes to Princess Mary. I think it's just interesting that they make their names so differently. What we remember Jane for, and we remember Jane so much better than we remember her father. What we remember her for is so different than how he made his name. And so similarities, definitely we could draw similarities in terms of what kinds of relationships they had and the meaning behind those relationships. But I think generally, in terms of their careers, very different. And then therefore sort of run parallel, because it's both, they still have a relationship with the crown, but in very different ways, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's funny. As you were saying that, I kept thinking this is one of those rare situations where a daughter or a woman overshadows a man.
Yeah.
Oh, Emma's raising her
Oh.
hand.
I don't want to interrupt anyone, because I've been told by myself I interrupt too much. But I agree. I loved what you brought up, James. I love it because it's like this gender stereotypical thing where the dad is the one who's like, oh, and then the daughter. But I've seen way too many times this not to comment. The humanist dad and the empowered daughter. Okay. So I see
Yeah,
it with other women too. And I am sure he taught her. He taught her so many things that she felt empowered. And it's with the women artists, it happens. They always have a dad who's
right.
an artist and and it happens with other diplomats. I'm thinking of Thomas More. I'm thinking of, and I think it's got to do with the fact when your dad is a humanist, he sees women in a different way
Mm.
and he educates his daughters, right? And then a little
Right.
girl who's been educated. And as soon as you mentioned Princess Mary in translations in Latin, I was like, whoa, it's amazing. So I love that you brought this up because I think this is what truly situates them in the humanist movement and in the Renaissance for sure, right? Both Jane and
Right.
her father. And I love that. I love that you mentioned that because, yes, we're not used to hearing that it's the girl who's the one who's more present, more
Yeah.
active, but it makes sense to me as soon as you said it. Maybe because I'm a bit like that, but it does make sense to me. And I love that you mentioned that. And when you mentioned the relationship with Princess Mary, was that a close one? Do you know?
I believe it was. I think it's one of the better substantiated relationships, actually, of not just of Morley's, but just in general in this period. I think what comes through in the evidence is that Morley, especially, had an admiration for Mary, and in that's just not just apparent in the presentation of these texts, which I think obviously you might argue that he's particularly pursuing her favor in that. There's something more about what the evidence tells us. For instance, they go to visit her. I say they. I should clarify that we know that the Morley family, so father, his wife, Jane's mother, and potentially Jane, but it could have been her sister, who went to visit Mary at Hunsdon. I think it was June 1536. So very shortly after Anne Boleyn's execution, I should clarify. But before Mary reconciled with the king. And I think that's crucial because at this time, Mary was still a figure of like a potential figure of sort of what's the word? Like disaffection. So it's sort
Mm.
of like if Mary could have been a figurehead for those who were not happy at that time, particularly with how sort of Henry's break with Rome and such. And I think the fact that they went to go and visit her, it just no, I wouldn't say it bothers me, but I always think about it. Like the implications of going to visit her, and but particularly when she was so out of favor, suggest to me that this family were close with her. And
Mm-hmm.
then that will raise the question of, well, were the Parkers not so closely aligned with the Boleyns that they wouldn't even
Mm-hmm.
look at Mary? And I love that because it just speaks to what we know about loyalties and obligations in this period. They were complex, they overlapped, they conflicted,
Mm-hmm.
and it's negotiating those, particularly in 1536, but just in general, um, negotiating those which sort of made and sort of broke these careers really. I think I'm guilty of this. I often talk about relationships in terms of political affiliation and what can be extracted out of that for advantage. But I actually get the impression from the sources that Lord Morley had a more personal admiration for
Mm-hmm.
Mary, was impressed by her, and there is also evidence to say that Jane also had that relationship with Mary. I'm a little bit more cynical when it comes to Jane, but she does. They do exchange gifts. Their servants travel back and forth between the two of them, suggesting that the two women did have a relationship. And of course, Jane did carry Mary's train, I believe, at Jane Seymour's funeral. So
Oh.
depending on how far you take the symbolism, why was it Jane who was carrying that when she was a Boleyn? You know, was a Boleyn though in 1537. Still a Boleyn, but
Mm-hmm.
by the
Yes.
time Anne and George have been executed, does anyone really look at Jane and go, "Oh, she's a Boleyn"? Not really, I don't think. She kind of takes on a different character after 1536.
Yeah. I
I
picked
think it
up.
could have been also a strategy. Sorry, Rebecca. See, I
No,
interrupted.
you're fine.
You wanted to say?
No,
Um,
go
I,
ahead.
I think that what that says to me, just very quickly, is that Mary was a figure to reconcile people. After what happened to Anne Boleyn was so shocking, I think that people were like, what are we going to do now, right? And let's go back to what we
Right.
know. And I think Mary, in that sense, was very was a figure that brought people back together because she was what they knew too, you know. And also, she was a humanist. She was trans. I mean, at 8, 11, she was translating from Latin. We know this because you know, it still survives. So I think this was just a humanist circle of people trying to navigate. Let's bring him up. The tool, Henry VIII. And Mary understood very well how her father was and how some people were just put between you know, in a very difficult position because of what happened. So I think you're right that we need to scratch further and nothing's black and white, you know, and everything
Absolutely.
changes. Yes, and I think women are those figures usually, especially, you know, women with, and you mentioned that he was a diplomat, and Dura we've mentioned ties, international ties to the Spanish monarchy and all this of the empire. It's like she's a leader. She's becoming a leader. She's becoming a leader in the Tudor court, and she is. I think she is a leader in the Tudor court. She's still. Henry never said that's not my daughter.
Mhm.
He always said that's not my legitimate daughter, right?
Mm.
Mhm.
He never said it wasn't his daughter. So I love that you brought this up, and I now want to like dig more because I've always like, even though I'm very critical of Anne Boleyn, I always think that it's more to it than that. I think that to just put in this position, it's just how can you cope with Henry? Really, is what just comes to my over and over when
Yes,
I think about these things. Coping with Henry just put everyone on the edge, and then when things change, people have to react very quickly because they know how he is. Now he thinks one thing, but now I think the total opposite. And if you're not on board, you know, we'll see what happens to
absolutely.
you.
Right.
So it's very interesting that you brought that up. Sorry, Rebecca, you were going to say something.
No, now I changed my question because I was like, wait, I have a different question now.
Okay, okay, go ahead.
So we know, like famously, Jane Boleyn got on the bad side of Henry VIII, right? I would love for you to touch on that for those who are unfamiliar. But then I'm also curious, did her father always stay in the good graces of Henry?
Hmm.
That is an interesting question. Absolutely. So, well, okay, so I'll start with Jane. I think that Jane and Henry just did not get along. I don't see any obvious favor for Jane from Henry in all these years. And I think it probably begrudged Henry a little bit. Like, I don't think he was happy about the fact that Jane remained at court after the fall of Anne Boleyn. I think it was required and necessary, and I actually do think it was a nod to her role in bringing down the Boleyns, in sort of
Mm.
her compliance, you might say, at the very least, her compliance with it. But I would say personally, her agency in that, in bringing something to the prosecution of the Boleyns in 1536. I think he had to allow her to be at court reluctantly, though. I don't think that Henry particularly liked her, and I don't think that she will have liked him. That's just my impression. But I think that Jane in particular had a talent for securing her own position and sort of keeping her own interests in mind. And with that, she was no fool in the sense of she would have known that the sovereign's word was what counted. And
Mm.
so she would never really have, I don't think, intentionally crossed Henry until maybe Catherine Howard, but that's getting a little bit too complicated. But in terms of her father, I would say he was remarkably good at using. He was like I always think of it as like the power of his pen. He was remarkably good with these translations and the way he presented them to important figures in his life, whether it was Henry VIII, Cromwell, or Mary, in sort of ensuring he sort of used them to negotiate these relationships that he had, I believe. It was his way of keeping favor with the king in particular, I think. And I mean, there's a brilliant example. I may have to consult my notes for this because I'm really bad with like titles of things, but people can find it if they want to try and Google it. But I think it was in 1543. Lord Morley, this was only 10 months after the execution of his daughter, and he translates a book. I think it's De Claris Mulieribus. I
Yes.
apologize to anyone who likes Latin because I don't. But basically, he translates this book about the historical lives of women, and in particular, sort of acknowledges in it the need to sort of control or govern women's behavior. And it's too coincidental that this was what he decided to translate and present to the king so shortly after the execution of his daughter. And it's been argued, not by me, because this is not my, as I said, this is not my field, but it's been argued by both James P. Carley and by James Simpson that this sort of translation was meant to be like a tacit acknowledgement of his daughter's fate and the justice of it. And I think Simpson in particular calls it the sacrifice of Lady Rochford. And I love that, and I also hate it at the same time, because I understand what he means is to say that his daughter, like Lord Morley, had to sort of, as maybe reluctantly, but he sort of had to acknowledge that his daughter did wrong and that Henry was right to have her executed. Is that the line that he was prepared to cross to keep Henry's favor? Was that what he felt like he had to do to survive and to remain in the king's good graces, especially after what happened with his family and only 6 years earlier, what happened with the Boleyns, who he was very closely aligned with? To bring it back to your question, Rebecca, I think he was just very good at maintaining relationships through through his writing, through his translations. And while I don't think of him as a particularly political figure, he definitely wasn't. He wasn't apolitical. He had a political mind. He knew how to assure his own position and to sort of keep those relationships intact, even at the sacrifice of his own daughter's memory, so to speak.
Wow. That's all I can say to that.
I love that.
It's sorry, that's a lot of information. I just
no, but you hit it right on the head when you mentioned
yeah.
the Claris Mulieribus by Giovanni Boccaccio, an Italian, the father of humanism, really. Who we love Plutarch because parallel lives. Thank you, Plutarch. But Boccaccio in the Renaissance is the guy really who writes the first book on famous women. This book that you mentioned. I love that you mentioned James Carley too, who is one of my favorite book historians in England. If you ever needed anything on the books of Henry VIII of his wives, you need to buy his book. And you are so right that I think this dad was making a point for his daughter, because if you go and read the Claris Mulieribus, they're famous. Not all of them are these just women praying. No. They get on horses, they fight wars. All these examples are strong women that sometimes have to do things that are not right for the ultimate good, right? Was this a dad's try to say, hey, my daughter, this was my fault for making her empowered, but this is good for us. I think there's a movement of humanists, and then go back to Sir Thomas More again and his daughters. I'd say Catherine of Aragon. She's the one who brings it, right? I think they're seeing a shift in Henry. He's realized that, and I think they realize Henry needs someone like that, someone who's calm, collected, but very educated, right? I think they're preparing for finding someone like Catherine Parr, to be honest with you, who embodies all of these things in a way that in England works, which is through Reformation and through rights. And this is why Catherine Parr is left as regent by Henry. I think all these people are trying to persuade Henry in different ways. We know Henry was in favor of humanism and not. But so the fact that you mentioned in 1543, the Claris Mulieribus by Boccaccio is one of the best references they've given us in parallel lives, James, by the way. I love it.
Well, I really don't feel like I could take this is, as you said, not just art history, but book history, especially 16th century literature. I lean on the upworks of much better historians, much better scholars, and I'm shamelessly citing them all the time because I know from having read these works those articles by Carley and Simpson, they're both in the sort of fantastic edited collection about Lord Morley. I think it's called Triumphs of English, and definitely well worth a read for anyone who's interested in sort of 16th century literature and translations. And the book does a really good job of trying to sort of put him in the right context. and also therefore give meaning to his translations, which again kind of goes over my head. But when I read them, and I'm impressed by the interpretations of the material. It's something which I am just in awe of constantly.
I think
Okay.
you're much too humble, and I need to learn from
Yes.
you, James.
Well,
He's very humble.
maybe.
I do want to go back to one thing, okay? Because I'm just really interested to know. You had mentioned Jane's sister, and I feel like I was like, Jane's sister. I read your book. It was forever ago, so I don't remember
Right.
anything about her. Who was she? Was she raised like Jane?
Oh my word.
Oh,
I
now I'm
don't
putting
think I
you.
know very much about her. I mean, I know it's in the book, so I
Yeah.
was right once, so I can afford to be wrong, very wrong on this podcast. And I'm just gonna say what I think it is, which is I think her name was Margaret. I think she had a sister named Margaret, and I think she had a brother named Henry. I think. And but Margaret, for what we do know about her, the references to a Mistress Parker early on in the source material, for
Hmm.
instance, in the account books of Lady Margaret Beaufort, we often have a
Hmm.
Mistress Parker, little Mistress Parker, which is obviously just a young girl. Often we don't know if it's referring to Jane or her sister.
Yeah.
And I like that because it could have been either of them. There is occasionally when it says Mistress Jane Parker or Mistress Jane Parker's nurse, which is a lot more helpful. But
Yeah.
when it says Mistress Parker, you can't. I don't think they were born very far apart from each other. I think she marries a Shelton because I
Oh,
think the idea is that they. I feel like I should check this while I'm here, just because I just don't know if that's completely wrong. But I believe that Jane's sister had a matrimonial alliance, just as she did with the Boleyns through by marrying George. I believe Margaret marries a Shelton, which
right.
obviously all these families of there's like a cross section of families that are all very living very close together. They have social ties and geographic ties. This is
Mhm.
something which, although I see Jane and her father Henry's lives as being so separate and kind of running parallel, there's no question that they will have had the same allegiances, similar allegiances, and similar relationships just for the sake of where they were born and the people that they grew up
Mhm.
with, the neighboring alliances and such. So yeah,
Yeah.
um, I know that there's some information about Margaret in the book, if indeed her name was even Margaret. This is terrible because I have such a bad memory and I like committing stuff to text when I know it's right. But your listeners will have to just do a quick Google if they're ever unsure. But I believe her name was Margaret, and there is more information on her in the book.
It seems like Margaret is a safe bet, right? Everybody was named Anne or Margaret
That's
or
true.
Well,
Mary.
yeah, and
Yes.
that makes sense. And Henry too, because of the king was Henry, and lots of
Yeah.
Catherines, and yes, so that's what I say. But what everybody's going to do, James, is put your book in their Christmas list because your book is wonderful, and you're
Okay.
much too humble because. I mean, this is the part that I get always lost in. So I'm so grateful that you even I mean, just to know that I hear Berlin and all I think is I'm Berlin, to be honest with
Yeah.
you. I did want to ask you, you said their lives run parallel, they're very different, uh, but they seem to have very different characters, right? Like she seems more like outgoing, empowered, and all that. Her dad is more like the quiet, kind of serious type. What about the relationship to her husband of both of those? To George, right?
Yeah.
Am I getting it right?
Yes. Yes. I
So George
mean,
Boleyn, what is his relationship to his wife and his father-in-law? Because we know we get into family dynamics here. We're close to the holidays, so this is always the tea's good. Did they get along?
yes.
Did they not?
I mean, this is going to be a very short answer. Sorry to disappoint you because we don't know very much at all. We don't really know much about Jane and George's
Hmm.
relationship. A lot of people have made a lot out of the fact that she promised to petition for his life in May 1536. A lot of people have made a lot of that, and I'm not so sure that that is as significant as people make out. I also think that we have some evidence that they wrote letters to each other because George was often on embassy, and we know that that's a nice thought, I guess, but we don't have any of the letters themselves, so we don't really know how affectionate the relationship was. But the bottom line is, because of her involvement in his fall, we often have accounts, say, especially 19th, 20th century accounts, which suggest that she had some ill will against him. Like they didn't get on,
Mm.
and she was determined to get rid of him, and she was the wicked wife. But actually, the evidence doesn't give us anything other than to say that they had a perfectly normal marriage. There's no hint of any unhappiness, any sort of very coincidental, circumstantial evidence that's been used to suggest that they had an unhappy marriage is very difficult to substantiate. But I think where the relationship that she had with George is sort of similar to her father's is that often in this period, many relationships were drawn along social lines and sort of extracting maximum advantage from this marriage. What am I going to get? What is he going to get? What is our family going to, how are our families going to become more closely aligned by this marriage? And so I think in that sense, Jane's sort of destiny was to have a good match because of who her father was and who her mother was, as was George's in a sense. And
Yeah.
actually, I think Jane probably brought more advantage to that match.
Oh.
But I don't think I know very much, if anything, about Lord Morley's relationship with George. I think um, the sources are very quiet when it comes to the Boleyns in a very frustrating way. I mean, we remain so compelled by them, and yet we know so little about them. It's incredible, really. But
Yeah.
yes, that's a tricky question, and I somehow managed to talk about it for a few minutes there. But we don't know very much, is the answer. So we
Hitting
often
all
have
the
to
spots
speculate.
today, James. Hitting all the spots today. But this, I wanted to say this. This does speak of the greatness of your work. I get the easy job to talk about a person who, sadly, a lot of the sources are gone, but there's still so much. And Henry VIII, same thing. And once you get removed from those king and queen, it's so difficult. And what you're saying is just speaking of that difficulty. They're famous characters, but we know so little because the sources tell so little. And then your work gets entangled in all this, 19th. I hate the 19th century. I just said it.
Those
It gets entangled
Victorians.
into all these constructions, right, about the Boleyns. And everybody has
Right.
opinions about anyone who was around, anyone with a name Boleyn. And
Right.
I get very frustrated when it happens with Catherine of Aragon, but I can only imagine it's just as frustrating when I do it to the Boleyns. But it's true, it's so difficult to learn about these people. And and don't get me started with what you mentioned, they all have the same names. There's so
Right.
many with the same last names. I just admire anyone who has the determination to go through these very difficult sources, look at them, know who's who. And I was never. You remember the game Who's Who? I was.
I do. Yes. Guess who in the
Yeah,
Oh,
UK,
Guess
as we
I
Who.
was
call it.
good
Yeah.
because it was faces. I was good because it was faces. But
Right.
imagine if it was sources, I would be the worst because I always confuse them. I'm like, who's that? Who's that? Who's that?
Yeah.
So I think what you do is very, very important, and I think people should realize how difficult this is, how extraordinarily difficult it is to write a book about someone like Jane Boleyn. It's
Yeah.
extremely difficult.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
James, I'm sorry. I have
No,
to
please go
ask
ahead.
you because you said that you thought Jane brought more to the marriage than
Hmm.
George brought, and I really want you to elaborate on that because obviously Henry is Jane's father, so it'll kind of all mesh together. But what did she bring?
Well, yes, this is probably another short answer. Just to clarify, I think all I mean is that I think she had more of a noble heritage, you could
Hmm.
argue, than George did. And this, when they were married, was in 1525. So you could argue that there was no really knowing that the Boleyn ascendancy was going to happen quite so dramatically as it did. If they'd been married 5 years later, you could argue that George was the more attractive prospect because of the fact he's the brother of a would-be or soon-to-be queen. But in 1525, not so much. I think the daughter of a baron, arguably, it would have been a better prospect, for want of a better way of phrasing it. But yeah, so I think that Jane was the better match in terms of the marriage market. In terms of what she brought to the marriage, I really don't know. I don't even know what George brought to the marriage. It's such a shame we have very little concerning their marriage, but that's not unusual. I think in terms of the more day-to-day normal lives that these people led, we often don't have anything because they didn't really have any reason to record it.
Exactly. And then we get all the information from Catherine and Henry's marriage and Anne and
Oh,
Henry's
right,
marriage that
yes,
everybody thinks is the same for the rest of the people at court. And I mean, it's the most famous divorce of all time,
right,
the Catherine of Aragon, Henry VIII for sure. Anne Boleyn is
absolutely,
probably the most famous Queen of England consort. So we have to fight against this notion, and then everybody has opinions about everything. So we have to fight against this notion that it's just so easy to go, oh, what did George do in his life? Well, we don't know a lot of what these people were doing. But as soon as you mention diplomat and being going on diplomatic missions, these people, like artists marry their children to other artisans and things like that. Humanists are looking for other, because it makes sense too, right? But I look at it from
absolutely.
that perspective. But you're right that it's also these these court alliances that are old. They're not just built in the reign of Henry VIII. This goes far back, right?
Absolutely, absolutely.
I've been having so much fun talking about this. James, I want to know before we go, because we've already been talking
Yeah,
for a while and I've been
Oh,
really
we
enjoying.
cannot go.
I
No.
know. I want to know, was there anything when you were thinking about doing this episode that you thought immediately, I want to touch on that, and maybe we haven't covered it today?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I'm typical for making so many notes for this kind of thing, and then the moment we start, it's like it's gone. Like
Yeah.
I've completely ignored my notes, which have been on one half of my screen this entire time, and I haven't really. They're like my safety net, you know. But I
Yeah.
think it's a credit to the two of you actually that I haven't even looked at it. So I'm sort of quietly, I don't know if you can tell from my camera, slyly looking at it now, trying to see if there's anything I haven't mentioned. But I'll be honest, when it comes to Lord Morley, I learned quite a lot just trying to prepare for this because I kind of only really bothered to learn as much as I felt was necessary to give context to Jane's life. And I would, again, I love when you have an excuse like this to go and research something in more detail. I find him fascinating. I'm personally going to read Triumphs of English again, that book I mentioned, the edited collection about Lord Morley,
Mm-hmm.
because I want to know more about him. I can also recommend sort of anything by James Carley. He's fantastic.
Yes.
Nothing sort of comes to mind. I think what's really interesting to me, and one of the things that I sort of thought about when preparing, is just this. I think I touched on it briefly, but just how different their lives and court careers were. And I say that because I mean he didn't really have a career at court, so to speak. But how we know Jane's name and how we remember her is probably not what he had in mind for her when I imagine it was either him or her mother who helped her get a foothold at court, helped her become a maid to
Mm-hmm.
Catherine of Aragon in the
Mm-hmm.
first place.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the typical career of a maid of honor or a lady in waiting is one which is characterized by loyalty, obligation,
Mm-hmm.
service, and virtue, honor. And none
Mm-hmm.
of these words stick to Jane very well, in
Oh
my
my
opinion. I
goodness.
mean, Jane's a controversial figure, so there is a very opposing view to what I think Jane is, my interpretation. But that's what makes her so fascinating. But it did occur to me while I was thinking, Lord Morley's character is so different to Jane's, and I don't believe that he would have wanted that for her. I mean, obviously, he wouldn't have wanted her to die quite so spectacularly as she did,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't think that he ever could have predicted, as perhaps no one could have back then, that that was the course on which Jane's
Mm-hmm.
life and career would go when she first became a maid to Catherine of Aragon in around 1522.
Mm-hmm.
14 years later, she was involved in the downfall of a queen and her own husband. And
Mm-hmm.
then, another 6 years later, she was responsible? Certainly very intimately involved with the fall of another queen. And that's what really struck me when I was reading about it, is trying to really understand and appreciate what it must have been like for Morley as a father to lose
Mm-hmm.
his daughter, but also to sort of have to then continue on, sort of trying to keep the favor of a king who basically had his daughter executed. You know, it's an incredible thing. I wish that their lives in the surviving source material interacted more often. This is very typical of the Tudor material, where the more intimate or personal relationships that you'd expect to find are just not there because of the nature of the evidence. Like we have state papers, we have chronicles. This stuff doesn't really care about the personal relationships of people. There are exceptional exceptional bodies of work where you can access these things, like say the Lyell letters, but often familial contexts are missing. And in that sense, you know, that's what makes the two of these people have Jane and her father Henry's lives parallel. And you know, they're very much running alongside one another, and they must have they must have had, maybe you'd think, a warm and affectionate relationship, but there's just nothing to go on. There's absolutely nothing. So yes, that's one thing that really did strike me while preparing for this, is just thinking how much they must have interacted, but how none of that has survived, and how Jane's career is extraordinary to us and remarkable, but probably was nothing like what her father imagined it would be.
Yes.
I
James.
must say that Catherine was a tough mistress. So if her father could see potentially a rebellious woman in the making, it would have been
Absolutely.
like, send her to the queen. The queen will know what to do, right? And
Right.
Catherine had a very nice way of telling you with a smile, you better behave, right? And I think maybe for a girl, a woman's figure, authoritative figure, it would be, you know, the right way to go. I'm just fascinated by everything you said. And now I want to know more. So it's just, it's incredible. It's incredible what how incredible the 1520s are in the court of Henry VIII. I always say and argue that, especially the early 1520s, we don't know that much about, even though they were extremely important. So I love that you brought up 1522. That's around the time that Mary's betrothed to her cousin, Emperor Charles V. So I do think we need to dig more, and I think maybe we need to collaborate more, James.
Yes, maybe I'll
We
come
do
back on
have
again.
a new
Yes.
series. Rebecca, can I mention that, or do you want to say it?
No, you can. That's fine.
Okay, we did start a new series called Historical Tinder.
Oh yes, I saw. Well, I've watched.
What did you think? Did you like it? You better say you liked it.
I think anything that brings the 16th century closer to today is excellent. I think it's a good
Thank you
idea.
very much. Good.
That was Emma's idea.
I'm really tempted to say we're going to drag you back. Probably for
Please do.
Historical
No,
Tinder.
it's been my pleasure. I mean, Rebecca, as you know, I always am so grateful when you've ever had me on as a guest before to talk about my research. But any excuse to come back and talk to you both, absolutely, I'm here.
Oh, you're so sweet. And I want to quick plug all of your writing, and I'm going to try my best off the top of my head to get it right. So Courting Scandal was your first one about Jane Boleyn.
That's right.
Then you did Christmas with the Tudors.
That's right.
That's one of my favorites. That's one of my favorites.
Oh,
yeah.
Thank you.
and then the most recent one was Serving the Tudors, right?
That's correct. Yeah.
Yes. And I have to ask, because
big fans, you can tell, right?
I know we are big fans. After I interviewed you about Serving the Tudors, I asked you what was next, and you said a break. You wanted to take a break. And I had now it's been a while, so I have to see if there's anything that you're researching or thinking about writing.
There is. I'm very close to finishing something, which I can't mention what it is. I can give you an exclusive in the sense of it's about Anne of Cleves, but I can't say anything more than that at the moment because I can't be sure that I'm going to get it out in time, if as in my head, what I think the schedule of this is. But I'm very excited about it. And I mean, you don't even need to ask. I will insist on coming back just to talk about it once it's ready, if you don't mind. Because, you know, I would be very grateful for that. But yes, I have been working on something for the past 7 or 8 months. And I'm obsessed with it. I'm a slave to it. I really cannot wait for people to see it. And I'm probably the most excited about this that I have been for a while. You know, when it comes to history, I hope people are as into it as I am, because I chose something which really I'm interested in. And part of me just thought I couldn't care less if this is something that publishers would want. I don't care if anyone else even reads it. I'm just doing it for myself. And hopefully that enthusiasm that I have is catching.
Your whole face
Well,
lit up when you started talking about it. So we can tell your passion behind whatever this subject is going to be.
I haven't been able to
well,
talk
we've
about
read
it,
your
so
book,
thank you
so
for
we know it's going to
asking.
be great.
Yes. Well, I
Thank
can't
you.
wait to have you back to talk about it when it's ready.
Yeah.
But otherwise, Dr. James Taffe, thank you so much for joining Dr. Emma and me today.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's been a pleasure, really. Thank you both.
Thanks for listening to the latest episode of Dr. Emma and Me. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to rate and review the show. It really helps more people find it. Don't forget to follow or subscribe so you'll know as soon as a new episode drops. And if you'd like to support what we're doing, head over to Patreon and become a patron. You'll get early access, bonus content, and more. Thanks again for being here. See you next time.